I worked with Hilary for 26 years, and it makes me tremendously sad to start this academic year without him. Hilary was a constant in our program. Everyone who came and left over these past 3 decades. We received dozens of messages and emails from alumni after his death. Everyone shared what he had taught them. Nearly everyone mentioned how Hilary always treated his students as writers. Writers in training, maybe, but always as writers. In the many years we worked together, Hilary published a number of novels and essay collections. In every one he gave to me, he wrote nearly the same inscription: to Sharon, dear colleague and co-conspirator. I never really knew what he meant. I got the dear colleague part, but I never understood what I was supposedly conspiring with him about. Was it CMU? Was it the program? The department? I did ask him once, and he smiled. You know, Sharon, you know. I've been thinking about this inscription, and I've come to the conclusion that this was his way of acknowledging the life of a writer. I think more than anyone, Hilary was conspiring to turn his life into narrative. Quite simply, telling stories was how he lived. It was intrinsic for Hilary that there was always life as it is lived, and life as it is put into words. In Last Stand's Notes from Memory, Hilary wrote, "We use narratives to iron out the discontinuity of our lives, give tumbled events a cause and effect, even a reason that they might not have possessed. The endeavor comforts us as it helps us believe that we were in some way in charge of the past when it was happening, a condescension as much as folly, though this behavior might explain the myopic affection we have for the past, worked into sweet nostalgia like a piece of leather until it is soft and supple to our self-appraisal." Years ago, Hilary and I went to the AWP conference in Chicago together. This was when you could still get a seat in the hotel bar. And he was outraged when I ordered a glass of red wine as a cocktail. Red wine, he explained to me, and was miffed that I didn't know this, was for meals. I could order wine at dinner, but I should never be so uncouth as to order wine after a hard day of interviewing. He went up to the bar and got me a martini, and then for the next few days taught me how to drink them. These are his directions. You take a sip, you tell a story, you take another sip, and you let your friend tell a story, and then you both take sips. The university would not allow us to have either gin or vodka this afternoon. I did ask, and they said no. So I'm going to ask you to raise your metaphorical martini glass. Take a sip and listen while we tell you some stories about Hilary, and then take another and another.
My name is Laura Scherb, and I'm a senior majoring in professional and creative writing. I had Professor Masters for 2 classes. From the moment on the first day of classes when he shuffled into the room, trademark yellow socks around his ankles, clutching a book and a paper cup full of water, Hilary brought a distinctive flair to Baker Hall 225B. Churlish enough to argue with you about your own writing in front of the entire class, but soft enough that he could be persuaded to take the class outside on a sunny day, Hilary always seemed to me that he was the grandfather of writing. He had a very particular kind of old-school charm that made you believe, no matter how many times he completely forgot your name, that he really did have a personal vested interest in your success. My first class with Hilary was a fiction workshop. My next was a personal essay class. In both, I wrote stories about love, which made me feel immature and inexperienced in the face of the other writers in the class who dealt with much tougher subject matter. But Hilary helped me and my classmates see that there was incredible value in using our own life experiences, no matter how boring we thought them to be, to inform our writing and not just the nonfiction. He told us stories about waitresses that he and his friends had tortured with mean names. He reflected on the loves of his life, and he told us about his frustrations with technology. Using his own incredible and often very colorful experiences, he would regale us with his quips, which have been scribbled in my notebook and posted by some of my classmates on Twitter, and then he would push us to make our own lives as important as his was. He made us think intensely and purposefully about every line we put on the page. Why was it there? What was it doing? How come it wasn't somewhere else? Why were we even writing this story? He was tough and persistent with these questions, constantly driving us further and further towards the edge, and in the worst possible way, the way that made you want to come back to class the next time, even more fired up about writing and even more determined to give him something good to circle with his red pen on your next draft. Reading through the drafts that he returned to us was like reading through the book of God on Judgment Day. You held your breath your entire way through, avoided the mysterious stains of food, and then at the end, you would read one or two words that would determine your fate. While a bad essay was never met with anything worse than a series of ellipses encouraging you to think more about where you were going, a few words scribbled in red pen that would indicate a good essay made your week. Hilary was the kind of person who made you crave praise, and when you got it, you documented it well. To this day, I still have pictures saved on my phone of essays that he noted with "wow" and "a valiant blast." Those have been there for 2 years at this point, and I can't tell you how many times I've deleted other pictures since then. I even sent those to my mom the day that I got them, to brag a little bit. I have emails archived from him that refer me to separate pieces that reminded him of my work. They talk about specific essays and what he liked about them and what he didn't, and they encourage me to keep going. On the days where I'm doubting myself, they're the first place I look. One day, I went into his office for a mid-semester review of my work. I quietly walked across the Glad and pushed open the door to see him staring at the wall above his typewriter. He asked me about my writing, not specifically the writing that I was doing for his class, but writing in my life and what it meant to me. In the face of my hesitancy, he told me to stop being afraid and go out there and write what I saw. He gave me a book of Chekhov's stories, pointing me to the lady with the dog. I promised him I would return it as soon as I had finished it, but he told me to keep it. Think of it as an investment, he explained to me, and to this day it's on my bookshelf. That's why I loved having him as a professor. We weren't just students in a class, like Sharon said. We were real people, real writers who had seen and done real things in our lives. We weren't just kids writing to get a grade, but we were real writers, practicing a real craft that is ancient and deeply nuanced. We weren't just faces staring blankly back at him as he talked. We were active participants in the conversations, and writers that he considered worth the investment of his knowledge, attention, and dedication. He is sorely missed in Baker Hall, but his inspiration and his passion will live on through his writing and through his students, whose writing was changed forever by his brilliant mentorship.
My name is González, and I teach in the creative writing program. One of our colleagues, Jim Daniels, was very sorry he couldn't be here today. He's currently on leave in Europe, so he's asked me to read some remarks on his behalf. So if you'll bear with me, please pretend that my hair is grayer than it is, that I'm a few inches taller than I am, significantly thinner, and that I've published 47 more books than I have. This is from Jim. I'm sure others will talk about Hilary's accomplishments as a writer, as well as his contributions to the creative writing program and the English department at Carnegie Mellon. So I just want to share a short personal reflection on Hilary as a person. I worked with him for 32 years, and we shared an office when he first arrived here, back when we were both on one-year contracts. We created a narrow wall of bookshelves between us, but in that small office in Baker Hall, we both could hear everything when we met with students, so we got to know each other's styles rather quickly. I always admired him for his strong work ethic and his sense of craft. As a writer, he had high standards for himself and for his students. You always knew where you stood with Hilary, and I appreciated his directness and honesty. He felt that you should earn your awards and publications, recognition, and respect, and he was not afraid to take on authority in terms of what was right. For example, many of you may not know of Hilary's powerful piece of investigative journalism, Go Down Dignified, that appeared in the Georgia Review back in 1981. New York Magazine, which had originally commissioned the piece, gave Hilary a kill fee and did not publish it for fear of getting sued. The article presented in great detail connections between the judges for the National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowships and recipients of those fellowships. Of course, this made Hilary some enemies, but he was exposing unsavory trading of favors more typical of Washington politicians than writers. But Hilary also made some friends with that essay, writers who had noticed the insider trading but refused to speak up for fear of being blackballed. As many of you do know, Hilary never hesitated to speak up. Back in our tiny office, we often talked to each other over the wall of books. He was the same age as my parents, so our friendship had an interesting generational aspect to it. Hilary had already done enough for 2 lifetimes, and yet he was starting a new career in his 50s. Since we both felt a little bit like outsiders to academia back then, we had a kinship. We wondered, frankly, what we were doing here, and joked that someone would discover us as imposters. Over the years, we attended each other's weddings and shared many wonderful meals, particularly those Hilary cooked. To me, he never seemed happier than when he was in his wonderful kitchen on Monterey Street in the Mexican War streets, on the north side, joyfully clattering pots and pans. Hilary had a loud, assertive, contagious laugh. And when I think of Hilary now, what I remember the most is that laugh, blessing the books on the shelves between us, then rising over them to my side of the office. I smile as I write this, hearing that laugh. Again, that was from Jim Daniels, who wishes he could have been here today. Now, on a personal note, as some of you know, I just began teaching at Carnegie Mellon 2 years ago, so I didn't have the pleasure of working with Hilary for as long as the rest of my colleagues in creative writing. However, about 12 years ago, I was an undergrad at Carnegie Mellon, and I did get to know Hilary a little bit. I never took a class with him, which is something I wish I'd done because all of my friends who did spoke glowingly of him. That said, even though I didn't get to know him in the classroom, he took the time to talk to me and to get to know me personally. As those of you who know me can attest to, I'm a fairly shy person, so these overtures came from him. And this is something that meant a great deal to me. We'd talk in the hallways in Baker, in the Glad. He'd invite me into his office. He would ask me what I was reading, what I was working on. We'd talk about books, politics, Mexican muralists, which is something he was very much into at the time. And he'd tell an occasional story about one of his remarkable past lives. I visited his beautiful home in the north side, and on one occasion, when he and Kathleen came to Puerto Rico, which is where I'm from, they had the kindness to take me out to dinner. It's a meal I still remember vividly. We went to a little beachfront restaurant that I'd never been to before. Hilary wisely ordered the fish, and I got a steak which inexplicably arrived with 2 fried eggs on top of it. This culinary faux pas both amused and appalled Hilary, who was not only a gentleman of letters, but also a culinary connoisseur. And he remarked something along the lines of, "Why would anybody do that? Why would they put that there? It doesn't make any sense." In any case, the fact that I had such a relationship with Hilary, a professor whom I never had a class with, a writer I admired who never had much of a reason to show me any attention, obviously speaks to his great spirit of kindness and generosity. This thoughtful character was once again on full display when I returned here as a faculty member. He welcomed both me and my wife Lauren to the faculty with open arms, and I only wish I'd gotten to work together with him a bit longer. I know that I'll certainly miss him. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jane McCafferty, another colleague of Hilary's, and I feel like Hilary was one of those people who knew how to live. He really knew how to enjoy life, and he knew how to communicate to you the stories of that life enjoyed. I think of him after coming back from summer and seeing him in the hall, and how he always had a really good story to tell about summer with Kathleen, or his travels. He was a great traveler and had wonderful stories that he brought back from France and from other places in Europe. He had a really, I think, a very generous spirit. And one of the things I enjoyed seeing in a clip of Hilary was that somebody noted that Hilary's gesture, his most sort of iconic gesture, was this, that he was this open-armed person. And I hadn't realized that till somebody pointed it out, but it's true. You'd see Hilary after not seeing him for a while, and that's where he was. He was just ready to embrace life and embrace the people that he knew. The other thing that I would add is that this has kind of been said already, but he was just the consummate host. Nobody knew how to throw a party like Hilary, and what was so admirable is how completely at ease he seemed, even as he was handling so much. He just seemed to be having such a good time watching other people have such a good time. So I thought I would just read a little, the beginning of a story of Hilary's. Hilary was a really fine short story writer, and I picked out the beginning of a story called On Silver Skates. The green balloon rose through the tree. Hendrik remembered thinking some kid his age must have let the string slip through his fingers, distracted by the puppet show or the clog dancers or some other event at the park fair, so the balloon quickly escaped. Hendrik remembers how the balloon had made its way upward through the tree, climbing dexterously from limb to limb like a gymnast or a monkey in a zoo. Each bump against a branch, any contact with a leaf twig, could have punctured the thin skin, but the balloon remained a perfect oval, a green idea, rising higher and higher, as if guided by some intelligence on the ground, perhaps by the boy or girl who had let it slip away. Or maybe he had done the trick, willing the balloon its safe journey, maybe making a bet with the powers that govern such things, that if the balloon did not burst, then this day would come out all right. He would not do anything dumb or silly to embarrass his father during the park fair, and the day would come out all right. He had held his breath as the balloon bounced against the maple's canopy once, twice, and then again, blindly feeling for an opening, and then suddenly it slipped through the leaves and into the uncluttered air, free. The other thing I'd like to do before I sit down is thank Vicki. Vicki, who, is she there? Is she here? Yeah. Vicki, who I think really enjoyed Hilary, and I know Hilary enjoyed Vicki, did a tremendous amount of work to get this event going. And I'd like to thank Sharon Dilworth too, but thank you so much. Can we give a hand to both of these people?
It's gratifying to see so many people gathered to remember our dear friend Hilary. I'm also gratified to be asked to say a few words about him as well. I used to be Bob Hoover, the one-time book editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, now in retirement. I knew Hilary since he came to Pittsburgh in the 1980s as a neighbor, a source of story ideas, and as a valued friend. And then I thought of him the other day when I read that stand-up comedian Amy Schumer, although it seems that she does most of her jokes in a prone position, signed a one-book deal with Simon & Schuster for $8 million. I'm sort of glad Hilary isn't around to learn that fact. As you know, he struggled for years to find a publisher for Last Stands, and I can guarantee you he did not get $8 million. I will also wager that he had a more interesting life than Ms. Schumer, whose celebrity status made her a more valuable commodity than any literary or serious nonfiction writer in the history of Simon & Schuster. He wrote once, and it was kind of prescient, in the horror of the last century, the risks of intelligence have so shocked us that we reach for the banal, not just with a cell phone, but in our politics and our literature. Now, the changes in literary publishing today would depress a writer who so enjoyed being part of the book world in its more reasonable and gentlemanly ways. A word I use with trepidation these days, but it's one that Hilary would understand. He was a gentleman in the best sense of that word, a writer who appreciated and supported other writers, whether they were veterans or students. Like so many, I benefited greatly from my relationship with Hilary. Story ideas, references to the famous writers of yesterday, including his father, lovely meals he cooked at his home, and from the 2 CMU students he suggested as interns for the book department. They turned out to be the greatest interns in the history of the Post-Gazette, so accomplished and talented that they could replace any reporter at the paper and likely do a better job. They even did what I asked them to do, and that didn't happen very often. I don't know what's happened to these 2 women, but they were well prepared for life after their internships. As I learned the hard way, when I mentioned Edgar Lee Masters in the same sentence with Hilary, he had a strong feeling of rivalry with his more famous father. He was one of the few people who had actually read my article, and he suggested strongly that he could stand alone, thank you very much. Yet he kept an eye on the treatment of his father's works, especially when Spoon River Anthology was turned into a play, and he was always careful to grant the rights to that production to a theater company that he had investigated. Plus, a portrait of his father was hung in a prominent place in Hilary's Mexican Ward Street's home, proving, I believe, that he felt a strong connection to Edgar Lee Masters' long career and his place in American poetry. My tribute to Hilary in the Post-Gazette recently was a labor of love, and I felt I had done my best in sending him off. When I learned that the article had made the list of most emailed stories 2 days in a row, I knew it was the subject and not the writing that made that piece popular. But Hilary had his own send-off. In his 1997 essay, Passing Through Pittsburgh, he mentions his grandfather's failure to find a home here many years ago, and the man moved west in search of himself. My search for identity is neither as desperate nor as direct as my grandfather's, Hilary wrote. But I am no less mindful of the struggle for identity, for a place on this river delta. So in the temporal coincidence some call history, my grandfather and I are merely passing through, and we are all the richer for it. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jane Bernstein. I was a colleague of Hilary's as well. I came to Pittsburgh for my on-campus visit in February 1991, and Hilary was my host. He introduced me before my reading and took me on a tour of the city. I suppose I should be embarrassed to confess that although I wanted very much to be at CMU, I was shaky about the prospect. I'd lived my whole life in or just outside New York City and couldn't imagine life anywhere else. I had a kind of provincial belief that New York was the sun and everything else was a dim, distant planet. I remember Hilary driving me up to Mount Washington and through the north side and past his house in the Mexican War Streets. I remember him pointing out the Warhol brothers recycling. And I remember Hilary's knowledge of the city, his affection for this place that had become his adopted home. But what struck me most as we drove through the city was feeling myself in the presence of a man who knew how to live fully and deeply, a writer, a teacher who was generous to his students, who'd made a home in the place where he lived, and who traveled widely. We arrived at the airport well before my flight and sat in a cafe in the terminal, and he told me that he'd met a beautiful woman at a party, Kathleen, and was in love, truly in love, for the first time in his life. And as he described her, his eyes welled with tears. So this, too, a passionate man, a man with access to his emotional life. When it was time to leave, I must have said something about hoping I'd get to see him again, and a little nervous, he said, "Well, we'll see." And so, an honest man, I respected that too. I arrived in August, and Hilary became my mentor officially. He was assigned to me. Very dutifully, at the start of each semester, he'd remind me of the responsibility he had to fulfill as my mentor, and we'd set a date to go out to dinner. Over drinks, he'd ask, "So, is everything okay?" And I'd say, "Yeah, I think everything's okay." And then we would turn to what really mattered, which was good food and good conversation. Hilary wrote, we all know this, he never expressed a sense of futility. He acknowledged that publishing had changed in enormous ways, grumbled and moved on. You're a writer, you write, that's what you do. He didn't say this, he did it, and in this way, he is my mentor too. A couple of years ago, I co-edited an anthology of creative work about post-industrial Pittsburgh and Glasgow and asked him if he'd contribute something. This was his contribution, which he wrote when he was 83. It's called One Spring Afternoon. Two large photographs hang on our walls here in Pittsburgh, both aerial views of Forbes Field, the old baseball park. One seems to have been taken from a plane and the other from the high tower of the University of Pittsburgh, just across the street from the ballpark. On this parapet, students crowd to peer over each other, their hands waving like victory pennants as they try to see the action on the postage stamp size playing field far below. A radio has just reported the news of Mazeroski's ninth inning home run to defeat the Yankees in the 1960 World Series. The echoes of that afternoon's history have been gradually rinsed away by the prevailing breezes off the confluence of the three rivers that meet at this juncture, and the students who cheered the Pirates from this high balcony have returned to earth and the making of their own life's history. Forbes Field is no more, nor the stadium that replaced it, and I sit along the first baseline of the new stadium. Its home plate and the seats behind face the lustrous towers of downtown Pittsburgh. They rise just beyond the outfield and across the Allegheny River, as if topped off only yesterday. I hold a warm kielbasa sandwich smothered with peppers and onions. A paper cup of the local brew, Penn Pilsner, is snugged into the receptacle on the seat before me. It's a bright, warm spring afternoon, and Kathleen is somewhere in the crowd on her way back to me. The game with the Cincinnati Reds is about to start. A few players are already warming up the field, and the fresh greenness of the infield looks as though it might have been trimmed by a Northside barber. Life seldom gets better than this. It was Fitzgerald who identified the pleasant clime of autumn as football weather, meaning, I suppose, one of those high, crisp afternoons with just a nip in its sunshine to suggest a scarf be worn. We attend baseball games these days in all forms of undress, but not long ago, suit jackets and four-in-hand ties were the rule. Old photographs show entire bleachers stapled together by their exclamation points of neckties through the faces of their wearers remain blurs, a chorus of ghosts with good posture. Kathleen's father sits in one of those photographs. He attended the series in 1960, and she sometimes looks for him but cannot find him. Baseball is a game played in a pasture where memories graze. The pastoral has been, I think, an important attribute to this game, originated by farm boys in the 19th century and played pretty much the way it's played today, but for the regrettable introduction of the designated hitter by the American League. This patch of green meadow below, no matter how encased it may become in concrete, pulls at something deep within me, to become the source of a relationship measured 90 feet on each side, but as yet immeasurable. We come here to witness the challenge of a lone individual against 9 others, and it is a ritual as determined as anything the Greeks may have contemplated. The sound of that bat connecting with a ball the size of a fist sounds like no other, and its ramifications rise far beyond these cement boundaries to affect an entire city, a whole history. One solid smack. The order of the day has been transformed, righted or made worse, and while the innocence of this play may be reproduced, it is never completely ordained. Kathleen arrives happy with her success. A hot dog with lettuce, tomato, and mustard. The Pirates take the field, and hope is lifted once more into the afternoon.
I'm Peggy Knapp, also a colleague of Hilary's, but from the Literary and Cultural Studies part of the department. I remember Hilary's job talk. I liked and admired him right away, and I kept on doing so for all these years. He was a great colleague, generous and loyal friend, who quite recently made cranberry bread and spent an afternoon with my family conversing with my daughter-in-law about her first in-progress novel. I also admired him for his style of being a husband. So many writers of his generation make their celebrity through a certain kind of flamboyance, but his steady love for Kathleen and his joy in being with her was apparent to my husband and me. My husband is a colleague of Kathy George. But mainly, I want to talk today about my admiration for his talent, for the range of it. He was interested in everything, across time, across geography. And he knew a lot about a lot of different things. He knew quite a bit about Middle English, evident from his 1993 story, Getting to Cuba, which, by the way, is a great story. The French countryside, all kinds of food. That does come up a lot, doesn't it, this afternoon? Central and South American politics, the nuances of visual art. He did a lot of different things. He threw himself into experience, however challenging, sometimes in imagination, sometimes in person, and observed them closely. He wrote in many genres, but always with precision and care. He wrote novels and stories that were both shapely and full of wild surmise, and he was eager to discuss them. In the Harlem Valley trio, Clemens, Cooper, and Strickland, he seemed open to large worlds. Those novels seemed open to large worlds, and yet at the same time intimate. I was particularly impressed with his enthusiasm for the personal essay. I would say he single-handedly brought it back as a major art form, and his belief in the importance of that form in this age when so much of the cultural scene has turned to film and media. He wrote, "The energies and multi-layered qualities of human ambition are never at rest and move too fast for ordinary film. They can only be taken by the novelist, the poet, or the playwright." And I think he took them very often. Hilary loved words, and he loved sentences, and he loved other people's books. This is from Montaigne's Tower, his essay, 1993. To my wife's agitation, books are piled on our tables, spill in heaps from stuffed shelves, and lie about the floor or on chairs like spoiled pets. I have a miser's greed for books, and I pick them up at random to read a passage or follow an argument, inhabit a poem. I carry them from room to room, portable transitions of thought, of the past into the present, only to put them down in maddening disorder. Montaigne's Tower registers his historical imagination. He really, I think, loved Montaigne. He loved Montaigne's mind. He loved his style. And I've always thought, since this since I read this essay, that he's linked in my mind with Montaigne, who's intellectually omnivorous, whose intellectual omnivorousness has left such a richly colored mark on our world, indeed, as Hilary's has.